dad's involvement. Now, he was part of the Cradock Four. He was burnt, where mutilated bodies were found just outside Port Elizabeth in 1983. When the TRC was set up, what were your hopes and dreams for the Commission?
Leanne, yes, thank you very much. Well, I think when the TRC was set up, there was the expectation that those people that were responsible for the murders of the Cradock Four, but not just the Cradock Four, but also the PEPCO 3, Mamu Victoria Mxenge, Spiwem Tim Kulu, just to mention a few names, that the people that were responsible for those deaths would obviously be brought to book, and that we would eventually see justice for the lives that were lost. And I think there was also that hope that for the first time, someone like my mother would be able to sit in an official capacity and be able to tell her story, because in the first inquests into the deaths of the Cradock Four, my mother and the other mothers did not get to speak for themselves. In court, they were represented by the now late Arthur Chaskelson. In the second inquest, they also did not get to speak in court because they were represented by Advocate George Bezos. So the TRC allowed them that opportunity where they could get to speak for themselves, where they could, get to release the pain that had been brooding inside of them for all of that time. Obviously with the expectation that those responsible for the murders of their husbands and our fathers would be brought to book, not just those people that were there on the night that actually committed the physical act of murdering them, but also those that had created the environment that made it conducive for those kinds of atrocities to be perpetrated in. So we were expecting justice, Leanne.
Yeah, and when you talk about unresolved business, Selo, this is, I think, what we're talking about is that, you look at a story like Lukhanyo's, and in his book he very much so talks about, despite the two attempts at reopening the case, the TRC, there's still nobody prosecuted for these murders. There are so many open wounds that are left 20 years on, and people are still desperate to get justice for these crimes that were committed. This is a very difficult thing to understand and to move on as a country if there's still no resolutions. Okay, so that's just reminding you about an interview that we did a little bit earlier this year with Lukhanyo Kalata, and there you also saw the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Selo Hatang. So as the government continues on a reconciliatory drive, researchers and philosophers have spent a great deal of time explaining that while justice alone is not enough for reconciliation, it seems to be a key element to it. Some have arrived at the conclusion that without justice, no reconciliation is possible. Reconciliation forms part of the process as involved in building or rebuilding relationships, often in the aftermath of human rights violations. Joining us now in studio, we have the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Michael Masutha, who will be chatting to us about what it will take for this country to achieve social and political cohesion. Minister, thank you for your time, and thanks so much for coming in.
And thanks for the opportunity, and greetings to all the viewers.
Minister, I think we began playing that little clip from Lukhanyo talking about his late father, and the feeling that when you look back at the TRC and some of the findings of the TRC and what it had asked government to implement have not been done, and justice is still not served. When you react to something like that, how do you feel that people still, all these years later, it's 20 years, the 20th anniversary of the TRC, 20 years after that, still feel that they've been failed by the state? What is your reaction?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't agree with the statement that recommendations of the TRC have not been implemented. What I would agree with is that they, in certain areas, have not been implemented to the full. For example, amongst the recommendations was individual reparations. There were about 22,000 victims that were identified, and the method of it was that the TRC ran a process where people would come forward and attest to the atrocities that they endured, as well as those that sought amnesty who also confessed to the atrocities they themselves committed, for which they would then have been considered for amnesty. Now, a total of out of the total of 22,000, about 17,000, just over, have in fact claimed and received the reparation that was fixed at 30,000 a person, and it was clarified in the regulations that this was not compensation but a grant, in acknowledgement that realistically speaking, you can't equate 30,000 to some of the suffering in the form of appropriate compensation per se. There are other recommendations that we've been battling to implement. Out of the over 500, just about 500, for example, missing persons whose remains were to be discovered as a result of extrajudicial executions through the Missing Persons Task Team at the NPA, we've only been able to uncover just over 100. And of course, we're on course to complete the judicial execution exhumations, those that were hanged, which was another factor. The recommendation, which has not started yet, is community rehabilitation. There were about 128 communities that were identified by the TRC who particularly endured gross human rights violations. There has been various attempts to engage in consultation with those communities in order to identify the most suitable and appropriate forms of rehabilitation of those communities. It's been a very complex exercise. We have now decided to ramp up our effort by now engaging with the municipalities of the affected communities as well, partly in order to what do you call it? Share the burden of rehabilitating those communities by way of tapping into the resources which are much greater than our own, that those municipalities would have as part of their normal development programs, so that we could come in with our own resources in support. But more importantly, to engage with them and through them to engage those communities as well as civil societies, organizations involved, in order to identify the most effective and sustainable interventions.
Still some people, I understand what you're saying, but there's still some people that are still desperately seeking answers. I mean, you look at the family of Ahmed Timol. Now, there's a prime example of a family that had to bring this to court, that had to seek justice and find the truth and the answers to the actual death and the cause behind it. Now, shouldn't these be cases, and again, I do say, referring to that interview, that the interview was when the Nelson Mandela Foundation actually released some of the transcripts from the TRC, and they say that they have desperate family members asking the Nelson Mandela Foundation to come and help them seek justice all these years later. However, their response was they can only do so much. It really is up to the government to seek this. Why is it up to individual families to find the answers and spend the money they don't have, as opposed to, say, the NPA coming in and getting involved?
You know, when President Mandela accepted the TRC report on the 29th of October, 1998, he did so, in his words, with all its imperfections, acknowledging that the process in itself would not have dealt fully with all the issues at hand. Hence, for example, the former President Thabo Mbeki in 2008 initiated a process to reach out to those who committed offenses with political motive through a special process to consider them for presidential pardon, a process which we have also resuscitated. Now, coming to the NPA and in pending investigations or finalization thereof for purposes of prosecutorial decision, it's been very difficult. The very fact that the team or process necessitated an inquest is because the simply relying on investigations did not yield all the necessary evidence that would have enabled the NPA to get on with their prosecution. So that is a classical case and an example of many such cases where you still need corroborating evidence in order to build, bearing in mind that with criminal cases you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt, and if you can show doubt in a case, then you've lost the case. So,
okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to speed it up a little bit, but if we look at the atmosphere in South Africa, when we talk about reconciliation in South Africa and we talk about individual, interpersonal, socio-political, institutional levels of social cohesion, there's a very big problem that is identified there. And I mean, I'll bring up an issue that arose over the weekend. We saw a video being posted by Zwanele Manye of a group of people still singing D-Stem. Now, that in itself shows a divided nation. People still looking back at the old days and saying, you know, that's the real, true South Africa and not this new South Africa that we're forced to live in. So that brings that big discrepancy and that social cohesion that people are angry about still. How do we achieve this? And perhaps closing the wounds of the past, settling what the TRC had said and wanted the country to go through in order to heal is one of the answers. And by speeding up that process, we could perhaps bring about this cohesion we talk about. Perhaps I can get your views on that.
Well, first of all, let me say there continue to be new atrocities perpetrated.
Oh, indeed they are.
Even beyond
That's why it's a difficult balancing act.
Beyond the TRC and during democracy, the justice system has a role to play there, and hence we're tightening our laws on hate crimes, which has got a bill before Parliament currently. But a justice system on its own will not unite people. At the end, it is about change of attitudes, and South Africans must decide how willing they are to build a new society that's based on principles of inclusion, where we seek to reach out to each other. We can do so much as the justice system. The TRC process did the best it could. It could not realistically address all the atrocities as much as, reconcile everyone. In fact, the former President Thabo Mbeki made that concession when he submitted his recommendations to Parliament for the implementation of the TRC, that we shouldn't even begin to assume that the TRC was meant to bring about reconciliation, but it was meant to plant the seed to set us on a path towards attaining that. So there's still a lot more work that would need to be done even beyond the TRC as well as the justice system to achieve reconciliation and nation building.
Well, I must say, one thing that's going to be interesting is to see what the new head of the NPA is going to do when it comes to these prosecutions and hopefully speeding up the process. But like you say, it's not just one institution that needs to work on this, it's a whole lot of them. But we thank you for your time. Thanks for coming in and talking to us. The topic we really were trying to tackle there is the issue of reconciliation in this day and age, and talking to the fact of the TRC and that so many things that were spoken about and told to the government to try and sort out have still not been finalized. So let's look towards the future and hope that this will be done as a matter of urgency. Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Michael Masutha, thank you very much for talking to us. It is 7:30 here on the program.